would be a good word. We're recording now.
Oh, jeez. Okay.
Yeah. As everybody knows, it is the middle of the night, and I've got Dr. Farrell
and
on
in the
line.
middle of the conversation.
Oh. Well, Joseph, this very nice person is a big fan of your work, and he wants to know if you see anything in the physics of the cosmos, i.e., a change in the Schumann cavity frequency, for instance, to support the so-called change in consciousness that is said to be happening.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, in a certain sense, the Schumann cavity resonance isn't a cosmic thing. It's an Earth thing. It's a terrestrial phenomenon. It's the cavity resonance of the Earth's magnetosphere and ionosphere and all of that.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I answered that question a long time ago. It was in an interview either with you or someone else. I can't remember. It's been about 5 years.
Oh.
And my response back then, if I recall correctly, was that no, I didn't foresee that, because to do that in a fundamental way, you would have to change the basic geometrical, geological, terrestrial configurations of planet Earth and the atmosphere and magnetosphere.
Oh, boy.
So, that was posited on the assumption that these things are relatively stable and constant systems. I haven't, to be honest, and anything I say is a guess, because I haven't followed any physics papers or anything like that have been monitoring the Schumann resonance. So I don't know if there are changes being registered or not. I seem to recall a couple of years ago there were some papers that indicated that it had changed very slightly over time, which again makes sense in a certain way, because if the magnetic field of the Earth, if the magnetosphere itself is undergoing any change, it's going to have an effect on the Schumann cavity resonance. And we know that the magnetic pole is moving. We know that the field seems to be weakening dramatically, and according to some, getting ready for a polar shift. So there's all sorts of things going on that might impinge on that. Would that affect consciousness? My belief is that it would in some fashion, because our brain waves, in fact, the brain activity of any animal that has a brain is plugged into the cavity resonance of planet Earth. It's kind of the background radiation that we live in. So it's any effect on the Schumann cavity resonance is going to have some sort of neurophysiological effect, but what that may be, I don't know. It may be heightened craziness on the part of people. We're certainly seeing a lot of that.
Yeah. Especially with the cops. Oh, boy.
Well, anybody in government, it seems that we're looking at just a pathological sociopathic class.
Yes.
But, it could be manifest in any number of ways. Tiredness, I've been very, very tired over the past few months. It could manifest in any number of ways, and the problem is I don't recall any studies that I'm aware of that have looked at this phenomenon in terms of its effects on consciousness over a prolonged intergenerational study. That's the problem here. So I'm guessing that, it's going to have some sort of effect. It's bound to. But how that effect would manifest itself, I simply don't know, because I'm not aware of any detailed studies of what's been going on and how it might affect mood swings. I'm skeptical, to be quite honest, of these kinds of New Age explanations that, we're entering an intergalactic dust cloud, the galaxy is spitting out a bunch of stars and they're headed in our direction, and we've got cosmic rays coming toward us, all sorts of stuff that is out there.
Yeah.
As mechanisms of explaining the coming revolution in consciousness. Well, I'm skeptical, because revolutions can be good things or bad things. Usually they're bad things, but
yeah, boom, boom,
boom, boom.
Yeah,
and I've heard explanations of that as part of the explanation, part of the physics behind the different yugas in the Hindu tradition. And again, as far as I'm concerned, 6 of one, half dozen of the other right now. We don't know enough about these macro cycles, I think, for anyone to say that any solution is anything more than a guess. It's a certainly plausible hypothesis, but it's one of many. So I'm sorry I can't be more specific. It's an interesting question, but I can't be much more specific than that.
Okay. Well, there's a lot of symbols out there, and I get a lot of emails, Joseph, from Christians about, this is a symbol of the mark of the beast, and this is this, and it.
Yeah, everything's demonic and satanic.
Yeah, and you and I were talking, and you said something that makes a lot of sense. It's those symbols.
I'm glad something I said.
Well, it's those symbols that the elite communicate through.
Yeah. Okay. I think I recall what we were talking about.
Yeah.
What you're looking at, what people have to understand, in my opinion, and I'm not saying that there is not a body of evil symbols.
Yeah.
We certainly only need to think of the swastika and what symbolically that has come to represent.
Yes, it didn't originally.
It didn't originally represent anything evil at all. But of course, by dint of its association with the Nazis, it's now a powerful symbol of evil.
Yeah.
So it's another important thing. I mean, that's a lesson to the point here. Symbols can change over time, can change in their meaning or the perception of their moral intent. And they can change slowly, or they can change rather suddenly and dramatically, as with the swastika in the West.
Yes.
Even in the West, the swastika, prior to the Nazi era, was used in many cases as kind of a good luck symbol or a symbol of good fortune or blessing or things like that. And you can go to Britain, or even in this country, there were things that were stamped with swastikas, and it had no intention of signifying anything related to the Nazi Party or its agenda. But symbols can change in their meaning over time, and it's important for people to appreciate that fact. But symbols themselves, if you look at what I think is kind of let's call it a hermetic or esoteric cosmology.
Okay.
We live in a culture where our fundamental view of the universe, our cosmology, is basically formed by the kind of physics that began to be developed from Isaac Newton forward. And the basic view in that cosmology is that the universe is a machine, and that it is subject to law.
Yeah.
And again, that's a very ancient view in a certain sense. The Egyptians certainly had the view that which was very unusual for their time period, that the universe and all in it was subject to a law, and that law in its fundamental moral construction was good, and that even the pharaoh was subject to that law. So in other words, Egyptian pharaohs are kind of different from Mesopotamian kings. Mesopotamian kings come up with their codes, but you look at them and there's no real suggestion that it's coming out of a cosmology that views everything as subject to law, and therefore their kings aren't subject to law.
Question.
Yeah.
I don't mean to interrupt, but if I don't ask this, I'll forget it.
Mm-hmm.
Are the Mesopotamian kings the same kings viewed on the kings list that with the long, long lives?
Well, can we write that down or something on a scrap of paper, and I'll try and remember to get back to it. I don't have a scrap of paper in front of me and a pen to remind me to write it down.
Okay.
But let's get back to this idea of the universe as a mechanism subject to law. That's principally the cosmology that most of us, in one way or another, have been raised in. Whether or not we accept all of it or not is beside the point. It's part of our culture. But if you move in esoteric circles, like Newton himself, if you are influenced by alchemical texts or hermetic texts, those types of things, the cosmology changes in a very fundamental way. Because, first of all, your cosmology suggests that the universe isn't a machine, it's an organism.
Yeah.
And while organisms are subject to law, and, even scientific laws, those laws aren't rigorously deterministic. They're slightly loose around the edges, if I can put it that way. And on the macro scale and in the large scale, what this means in the Hermetic view is that the universe, if I can put it this way, is a construct of intelligence, to be sure. Mm-hmm. But it's a construct that is an intelligent riddle.
Yeah.
Okay? It's a question.
Yes.
It's a puzzle for mankind to figure out. And I say that because the famous economist John Maynard Keynes gave a paper about Isaac Newton and about Newton's alchemy, and this is precisely the observation he made, that Newton isn't the first great modern scientist. He's actually the last of the magicians. He's the last of the people who looked out from Samaria and looked on the universe as a riddle to be solved. So in other words, the universe has built-in suggestions of the solution, but it's up to mankind to figure out what the solutions are. It's up to mankind to figure out what the questions are and then what the solutions are. In that world, then, you are not in a world so much subject to law as subject to symbols.
Uh-huh.
So in other words, symbolism is a part of the cosmology of the way these people think and operate.
Yes. And
the way that they communicate. And that's a very interesting thing, because what this also means is, I've talked with you and other people about what I have been calling in my books the topological metaphor of the medium.
Yes.
And let's refresh everybody's minds here about what that is.
Okay.
If you can imagine the initial state of the universe as being an infinitely extended, utterly sameness in time and space. In other words, there's absolutely no distinctions whatsoever within it. It's just one great big huge sameness.
Uh-huh.
This means that no category of thought or language or anything like that is applicable to it. It's a nothing. In other words, in physics terms, it's a nothing because you can't observe it. Mm-hmm. Let's now say that you divide this infinite sameness, that you cleave it somehow. So what you have when you get done cleaving is you've got three entities that result. You've got two regions of infinitely extended sameness, and then you've got the boundary or surface between the two. So you've got three entities. And they're all nothings, by the way, and they're all each infinitely extended. But now they're nothings with new characteristics. There's information that's been added into the system. All right, now, that's a very simplistic way of looking at what happens with this metaphor in Vedic texts and Egyptian texts. I go into all of this in my various books.
Yes.
People are probably sick of me talking about it as a matter of fact. But anyway, I talk about it again in the new book coming out, and I repeat whole sections of other books just to remind people that, okay, we're with the metaphor again. And there's yet another way of looking at it, and it's going to get us right to your King's List, okay?
Okay.
But when you view the universe that way, when you look at these ancient texts and see this metaphor at work, what they're also saying is that underlying sameness is the materia prima. It's the prime matter of alchemy.
Mm-hmm.
And what the three resulting things are the transmutations of that prime matter. So in other words, the prime matter is your philosopher's stone.
Yes.
It's able to transmute itself into different manifestations containing ever more and more information depending on how many times you repeat this process of dividing and cleaving and adding information to the system. Okay?
Yes.
That means that fundamentally, at its root in this esoteric, symbolic cosmology, that you're dealing with a universe whose principal constitution is analogy. It's analogical. You're moving from similarities of something in one context to similarities of something in another context.
Yes.
That's the way analogies work. But they're saying that analogy is a principle, constitutive principle of the cosmos itself, and that it can be symbolized, therefore, and manipulated. So in other words, this is the basis of sympathetic magic. This is the basis of ceremonial magic. This is the basis of the practices of the mystery schools. As above, so below.
Yes.
As above, so below. If you look at it carefully, it's an analogical principle. It's telling you that some particular thing that operates at a celestial level is reflected in miniature at a lower level.
That's even in the Gospels.
In a certain sense, yes. As you bind in heaven, so it will be bound in earth, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, you're looking at a hermetic cosmology that is able to manipulate these various regions or parts of information through symbols.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I said that we're going to look at how this plays into the Sumerian kings. You mentioned the Sumerian kings list and all those kings that have extraordinarily long life forms. And there's a kings list from Egypt too, the Manetho kings list.
Yes.
So there's an Egyptian version of this, and they both have interesting parallels because both of these kings lists from Mesopotamia and Egypt have three different layers. At the top layer, the very, very most ancient kings are the gods that live, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years long.
Yes.
Okay? And the Mesopotamian, the Sumerian version of it is that, the gods came down from heaven and lowered kingship upon the earth.
Right.
Okay? That's what it says, essentially.
Right.
Then after that class of beings in Mesopotamia and Egypt, then you have kings that are demigods. They're kind of part god, part human, interestingly enough. And they don't live as long, interestingly enough, but they still live a long time.
Yeah.
Then you have the final third layer, which are simply the purely human kings. All right. Now, I suggest this in the new book, Thrice Great Hermetica in the Janus Age, that what you're looking at is the genealogical version of that metaphor. Because if you look at that metaphor, as you continue the process of dividing all these nothings and creating more and more regions with more and more common surfaces, all right?
Yeah.
What you're getting is something that will look like a tree. You start with one thing, you divide it, it has two with a common surface, and each of these things can be cleaved again, and they will produce more and more. So you're looking at a family tree.
Oh my goodness!
You see, this is exactly the thinking that I call it the genealogical interpretation of the metaphor, because you have to remember, back in ancient times, they don't make this rigorous division between their science, their religion, their genealogies. What the gods are derivatives in this process of cleaving the primary medium.
Oh.
And that's exactly the way they view them. Because you know as well as I do the Gnostic cosmology, that as the gods continue their descent, they become more and more entangled with what? They could become more and more entangled with the world of matter.
Yes.
As they become more and more entangled with the world of matter, they become less close to the initial source, and therefore they incline ever more closely toward evil things and blah, blah, blah. Now, I'm not saying that this cosmology is correct morally or metaphysically. I'm just describing what they think about it, okay? So in other words, their genealogies of the gods are intimately tied. They're intimately related to this metaphor. This is what people have to understand. Now, with that said, if you have the view also that this metaphor constitutes the basis of sympathetic magic or analogical magic, then symbols themselves, once they become attached to a particular meaning within the unfolding of that metaphor, once they become attached to a particular level in that unfolding metaphor, they become the means to manipulate it. So you're dealing with, as I said when we started all this, you're dealing with a Hermetic cosmology whose principal view of things is not only that the universe is subject to law, but that law is fundamentally analogical in nature. And therefore, because of analogy, once you've said analogy, then you're starting to talk about symbols, because the symbols symbolize this process of a bit of information carrying over from one context to another. They become the means by which the magic is worked. So you're dealing with something very, very profound here, and I don't know if I'm making sense, but you're dealing with a magical view of the universe, but magical in a very different sense than most people understand it, because it's based on something real. It's based on a real metaphor that is capable, in my opinion, of being mathematically symbolized, and therefore, once you learn whatever sort of mathematics might be used to symbolize it, or even to create a mathematics to symbolize it, once you have that, then you have the basis of the magic itself. This is what,
whoa.
This is what I think Newton and Descartes and Leibniz were thinking when they were talking about hidden forms of analysis that the ancients knew that we've lost.
Yes.
I think this is precisely what they were thinking.
Well, we know that in the biblical text, it tells people not to have anything to do with astrology, that it's evil, that, you'll just fry in hell if you do. And yet, they use astrology.
Of course, yeah. Well, what does that tell you?
Yeah, it tells me that they don't want people to have information.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Bingo. It's something that they want to keep in the hands of an elite.
Yeah.
The book of Revelation is shot through with astrology. In fact, I think it's an astrological book, top to bottom.
Yes.
But that's another discussion. But yeah, this is exactly what you see with these types of symbolic cosmologies. Is you always see this idea, rightly or wrongly. I'm not passing any judgment on it. I'm just saying that you always see in history this idea that this knowledge has to be protected.
Yeah.
Now, to a certain extent, I can understand why, because within that esoteric view of the cosmos, of symbols and so on and so forth, it is always a part of that tradition that there is an aspect of this which is very, very dangerous.
Oh, yeah.
And that only the worthy should be given access to that hidden core, that hidden secret, that hidden thing that drives it. And if that be true, and I tend to think it is, then one can understand why they would be masking some aspects of it. But of course, once you start down that road, then you inevitably have the prospect that there are going to be evilly intentioned or inclined people that mask the knowledge simply to be able to use it as a mechanism or means of manipulation and power over others. So it's a conundrum. I've said many times that our modern power elite has suppressed certain developments in technology and physics, both out of a desire to monopolize it for themselves, but also out of a more altruistic desire to prevent it from getting out and into the wrong hands. Think of Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-il, having access to technologies that can blow up planets and so on and so forth. Well, we don't want them to have access to technologies like that.
That's for sure.
So to a certain extent, you can sympathize with these bankers and corporate people and so on for suppressing some of this. But on the other hand, if history is an indicator, then some of them are doing so purely for selfish gain and influence. So it's a conundrum. If I were to fall on any particular side of that moral dilemma, I would probably do the same thing. I'd probably say, well, better to chance that than openly declare all this stuff and let it fall into the hands of thousands of crazy people.
Yeah. Yeah, we have enough crazy people.
We have enough crazy people
doing crazy things.
Yes, precisely.
Oh my gosh.
So I realize that is not a popular view, but I think for the moment it's the correct one. But yeah, symbols. They do communicate in symbols. They do communicate allegiances and concepts through symbols constantly. You see this in the Middle Ages. The whole development of heraldry is symbolism. It's applied symbolism to denote genealogical descent, to denote family claims, family fiefs, even in some cases family occupations. They do communicate in symbols, so it becomes very important to read them. But to read them without blinkers. If someone starts writing me an email and says, "Well, what about this satanic symbol?" the switch goes to off.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah.
I'm familiar with all that, and it really doesn't get us anywhere to understanding the deep things that are going on.
That's right. I mean, it's to the point, Joseph, where a zero is a symbol,
Oh, yeah, zeros are symbols of nihilism, destruction, Satan, collectivism, socialism.
Yeah, it just doesn't end.
It doesn't end, and this is, you can get lost in it, and you can start seeing meanings and so on where there aren't any. And this is why it's important, I think, for people to take the historical approach and to understand that some of these symbols have evolved over time, and they've changed slightly in their meaning. And some of them, I'm doing a little paper right now on a particular symbol within Western literature that, when you really trace it, goes all the way back to Mesopotamia, and it's rather consistent. So, it depends on the symbol. There's so very, very many. Let me throw out one example.
Okay.
Let's take the image of the fiery sword. Okay, Excalibur, Joan of Arc, Charles Martel's sword. All these swords were reputed to be fiery swords.
Yeah, like the one guarding Eden.
And that's the other use of it. Yes,
yeah.
You find it in the Old Testament after the fall of man, guarding the Garden of Eden, and looky, it reappears in Star Wars with the lightsabers.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a fairly consistent meme. It goes back if you look at it carefully, it goes back to Mesopotamia, and it has few changes. And it even enters the Christian patristic literature, where that image becomes an image of the incarnation itself. It becomes an image of Christ.
Yeah.
Because the iron, the steel, and the sword is considered the human nature, and the burning part of the sword is considered the divine nature. And, they're united in one object that performs a cutting burn and a burning cut, to quote St. Maximus. So it even enters, Christian patristic tradition as a symbol of the incarnation. But it's a consistent image throughout all of this, from Mesopotamian lore on through the Church Fathers on into Arthurian legend, Joan of Arc, and so on and so forth. So it's an amazingly consistent symbol. And it usually is meant to symbolize something divine, something heavenly. Even in Star Wars it does this.
Yeah.
So that's one symbol. There's just all sorts of them, Georgianne.
I know.
We could be here all night. What I really want people to take away from it is that the view that elites work with symbols implies that the elite is working with a different cosmology altogether.
Oh, yes.
Than what you and I are working with, or what we live in. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
They work in a magical cosmos, but it isn't a magic that's higgledy-piggledy. This is what I want people to understand. This comes out of a deep, very old metaphor that, in my opinion, predates the classical civilizations, and that probably that metaphor is a reflection at its deepest level of a very high science and of a very high mathematics that we've lost and are trying probably to rediscover. Certainly Leibniz was trying to rediscover it.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a huge thing.
Yes, it is. Just how that flaming sword that guarded the way back to Eden.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I could put a guy with a flaming sword out here in front of my property at my gate, but my gosh, they could come around through the back.
Well,
and what I'm wondering, could that have been something to do with Mars?
Yeah, the symbols, the other thing about symbols is just like analogies, they all connect to each other. Again, think of that branching tree that I used as an image to explain this metaphor as it starts to unfold and divide. Well, these symbols are part of something else. They're part of a network of symbols that relate to each other in certain specific ways. And when you study how they relate by dint of certain common elements. The fiery sword, if you look at it carefully, is always associated, as I said, with something heavenly, and that usually means with peculiar or special abilities.
Yes.
In other words, we're not to think of these things as just a conventional sword. We're supposed to see this as an image of something being described in language that can't describe it in any other way because they don't have the technology to do so. They've lost whatever high science may have lay behind it.
Yeah.
Now it's interesting that in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, that flaming sword is said to have been removed from barring man entry to paradise because, again, Christ himself is that flaming sword, and the whole point was to readmit man into paradise. So, the image plays out in different ways. The problem that exists is that the imagery itself isn't uniquely Christian. In other words, since it does predate the Church Fathers in its Mesopotamian forms, where it's not a sword, it's a mace, okay? But in that form, it predates the Christian revelation. So I think ultimately its meaning is different, perhaps, and I underline perhaps, than the way the Church Fathers understood it. I don't have any quibble with how they applied it. They were simply using it as a means of trying to help people visualize how one entity could actually have two different natures cohering at the same time in it.
Wow.
Burning and iron.
Yes.
And two different operations as a result of the co-inherence of each, a burning cut and a cutting burn.
Yeah.
But symbols per se, once you start studying them, you soon discover that this symbol relates to that symbol, relates to this symbol. And you can kind of get lost unless you remember that what's relating them to each other is this process of analogy, this process of tracing some common element from one context to another. And that's how it all works. Now, there can be apt analogies and there can be inept ones. And in many cases you discover as you're looking through all of these bizarre symbols that some of the connections are rather inept, and some of them are so extraordinarily subtle and apt that, they kind of make you hit the side of your forehead and say, oh, well, golly, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Once you see the connection, once the symbolism unfolds its meaning to you, then you say, oh, yeah, that makes sense. So, these people operate in a cosmos of analogies. They operate in a cosmos of riddles. They operate in a cosmos of symbols. And those symbols are subject to their own kind of unique, peculiar, in my opinion, kind of analogical law, if that makes sense.
Wow. Oh.
Is that making sense?
Yes. Yes. Don't ask me to explain it, what you said, but
it's actually, it's hard to explain.
Yes.
It's hard for anyone to explain, but I think once people see what I'm getting at, I continually am amazed at the profundity of that cosmological view and at its ability to explain why so many ancient cultures are obsessed with the practice of magic,
yeah.
and why they seem to be stuck with it, kind of manically obsessed with it.
Well, Joseph, like the Aztec and the Mayan, murdering hundreds of thousands of people and cutting their hearts out, was to them a kind of magic.
Yes, it was.
I mean, how can...
Well, that arises, as I pointed out in Grid of the Gods, that actually, the sacrificial logic comes out of a peculiar reading of the metaphor.
Oh.
Because what happened in Vedic India, let's go back to the metaphor, you've got infinitely extended sameness everywhere, okay, and in all times. And then you cleave it. You somehow cut it.
Yeah.
And when you do that, what you've done is you've created three entities, two regions and their common surface, all right? But to another metaphorical way of looking at the metaphor, what you've done is you've dismembered it.
Ah.
So the way you approach those higher levels of the metaphor is you dismember people.
Oh, God.
You sacrifice them.
Ah.
So again, this is part of those danger areas. This is one of those known danger areas that emerges in some of these cultures. And you even have indications, if I'm not mistaken, you have indications that at a certain very, very ancient time this was even done in Egypt. And then the Egyptians turned their back on it, at least on human sacrifice, and began to restrict the practice of bloody sacrifices in a rather peculiar way. And I think it's because they began to see this metaphor operating very differently. So again, it's very, very complex, Georgianne.
Yeah.
And there is. I don't want people to come away thinking that this metaphor is all lovely and beautiful stuff, because it is in its fundamental, I think, lovely and beautiful, but I readily acknowledge that there were examples of human cultures and civilizations in history that twisted this thing and just began the most barbaric practices. The problem in so many modern examinations of this is they don't appreciate that they're looking at a cosmology, and they don't appreciate, if they do, what they're really looking at.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that there is an element within the current modern power elite that is still enamored of those evil interpretations of this thing.
The human sacrifice.
Yes, I do. I do think that.
Well, I think that's what war is all about.
Could be.
The murderous, rampant killing of people.
Mm-hmm. It could be. It could be. It could be one of the hidden motivations behind the Holocaust. It could be some hidden motivations behind various ritual serial murders and killings.
Yes.
It's a question I leave open because I really haven't studied it, but I do think that the basic principle here that I've tried to outline is probably what's in play.
Yeah.
But again, that remains to be seen. It would take some study to discern whether that's an argument that will eventually hold water. But that's my guess. It's powerful stuff, and we need to understand that. It's a technology. Let's put it this way: this view of the universe as a symbolic, analogical universe that has more in common with organism than mechanism.
Yes. That
view is, I think, the view that's emerging now. I think we're in the transition from the mechanistic science and cosmology that we've seen in the past 500 years, since Newton, really 300 years, that's underway. And it's neither a good nor a bad thing. It's just what it is. And we have to understand that this view of analogical magic, that what we're talking about essentially is a technology. And like all technologies, it can be applied for good or bad.
Yes.
And people have to start, I think they need to start taking their blinkers off and not condemning the symbol, but rather looking at the intention with which it is used and employed,
yes.
Which can be evil, there's no doubt about it, and which can be good, and there's no doubt about that. By their fruits you shall know them.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Well, Joseph, in Revelation, where it talks about the whore that rides the beast, what is that a symbol of?
Well, that's, again, the history of symbols is very important here.
Yes.
There are many, many different ways of interpreting all of this. In the Renaissance on into the early Enlightenment, it's very interesting that you begin to see, long before really it's even applied by Protestants to the papacy, you begin to see Hermeticists thinking, well, that's applying to the papacy. It's talking about the papacy, the whore that sits on the seven hills. Well, Vatican City is close to the seven hills of Rome. So some people began to apply it there. The whole idea of, the heavens being rolled up like a curtain, many people look at that little passage in Revelation and see, through some very sophisticated kinds of examinations of an astrological text, many people see that as a precessional cycle. Even the great Anglican biblical scholar Donald Alchin, Canon Alchin, wrote an interesting book about Revelation in which he pointed out that this whore even has resemblances to the Sumerian goddess Tiamat, the goddess of chaos, and that the 12 tribes of the book of Revelation are apparently arranged in astrological, zodiacal fashion. So there's all sorts of interpretations out there, and again, I tend to think of it as a highly esoteric book. having little to do with raptures and tribulations and so on and
Right.
so forth. I tend to think of it as a very kind of Yahwehized or Christianized astrological text.
Mm-hmm.
But that's one way of taking it. That, like I say, the Hermetic people in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance started taking it as a reference to the papacy.
Mm-hmm.
So there's all sorts of symbols. Symbols can be dangerous because they are capable of so many different interpretations, and that's why I tend to promote this opinion of mine that we're looking at something much deeper, much older.
Yeah.
That is much more formally explicit in its original ancient articulation in high antiquity than we know now.
Yes.
And again, the clue is when you have people like Descartes, fount of French rationalism, kind of in a certain sense the father of modern Western metaphysical dualism. When he comes out and says, well, the ancients possess some sort of analysis that we don't know, of mathematical analysis that we don't know, that they've disguised, that they've suppressed.
Yeah.
When he says that, I tend to sit up and take notice.
Yeah.
When Newton says the same thing, I tend to sit up and take notice. I mean, after all, these two men invented analytical geometry, which we use in most modern physics, and calculus, which we also use in modern physics. When Leibniz, I'll tell you what Leibniz says. He comes along and he says not only did they have a method of mathematical analysis that we don't know and that they have suppressed, he comes out and says it has nothing to do with numbers.
Oh.
And moreover, he said it was done by some sort of, quote, imitation of calculating, unquote. In other words, it had formal procedures that allowed you to manipulate symbols, like in the calculus, and out would pop the answer.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, oh my goodness, Again, this is the other independent inventor of the calculus talking here. So,
wow.
So, I tend to take these guys rather seriously when they say these things. And I think what they may have been getting at is what I've been calling this topological metaphor of the medium. I think they were seeing kind of the same thing.
Wow. Well, let's revisit the Tower of Babel.
Oh, there's another symbol for you.
Yeah.
Oh, big time.
Well, Joseph, could have they been building a Space Needle type, some kind of, like we have towers with stuff on the top that we can communicate with each other? I mean, they weren't just building a thing to build it.
Right.
And then this so-called God comes down. Oh my gosh, you guys are bad. He
doesn't say that. That's
well,
right.
Yeah.
He doesn't say that.
Well, he says that if you're allowed to do this, you can do anything.
Yeah, that's what he says.
Yeah.
So
it had to be something scientific.
Well, that's my thinking. I started thinking about that symbol in Giza Death Star Destroyed and talked about it in Cosmic War and have talked about it even as recently as Covert Wars and Clash of Civilizations, that it's an unusual story in the biblical text because in the context of the entire Old Testament, where acts of God or interventions of God are usually accompanied with some moral pronouncement that, whatever it is, mankind or Israel or whoever's doing something, well, this is wrong, don't do this anymore, and I'm going to come down and make sure you don't.
Boom.
Boom. But in that story, we're not told that, and it's an unusual omission in the Old Testament context. All we're told is that the Elohim, if mankind completes this, the Elohim say, well, if they complete this, they will be able to do, quote, whatsoever it is they imagine to do.
Yes, imagine to do.
Imagine to do.
Yeah.
And that, there are various versions of the Tower of Babel idea in other cultures as well. Certainly there's a similar story of confounding of tongues in Mesopotamian lore.
Oh my goodness, I did not know that.
Oh yes, yeah. I put that, I forget what book I put the Mesopotamian version in right off the top of my head, but I do talk about it. There's a version in the Mayan Popol Vuh, and so on. In the biblical version, it's suggestively militaristic because it's tied, in the context that the story occurs, it's tied to the activity of Nimrod, who was a mighty hunter and, conqueror and so on and so forth. And, what I believe we're being led or suggest that the text is trying to get us to see is that this conqueror is doing something, he's building something that's going to give him some sort of military edge. So it's a technology, I agree with you, it's a technology that if we look at other contextual examples of it, it sounds in some respects like all the lore associated with the Tablets of Destinies, and those we have to recall are said to have contained, quote, all the power of the universe, unquote. And they fought wars over possession of these things.
Yes.
So the way I look at the story, and have looked at the story, I was early on in my biblical studies something of a maverick there because I brought all of this up with my Old Testament introduction professor, and I said, well, it doesn't look to me like the concern here is anything moral. The concern here is that they're doing something that challenges the power of the Elohim.
Well, I bet you weren't popular.
No, I wasn't.
Oh.
No, I wasn't. To his credit, my professor had much more open of a mind than did the students in the class. But
well, they're brainwashed.
Yeah, many, sadly. But that's the way it looked to me. It looked to me more of a story of they're building something. There's a technology here, and it's very threatening to the powers that be.
Yeah.
And, we've got to go down and stop this. And it's interesting, I think we talked about this actually in our Cosmic War series a long time ago. It's interesting to look at the response here because Elohim, God, in the Old Testament comes down, what does he do? He halts the project by making it impossible to complete.
Yes.
And how does he do that? Well, he scrambles everybody's languages.
Now,
kind of hard to complete a project if you can't understand each other.
Joseph,
it's a perfect guerrilla warfare solution.
Yeah.
Come right down to it.
What kind of thing could be used to scramble people's languages? It would have to be another technology.
Well, it would have to be another technology. You would have some way of intercepting communications and scrambling the message from sender to receiver. You could so inundate a particular group's brainwaves and scramble them that they start talking nonsense and think they're talking sense. There's any number of ways. There's any number of speculative possibilities. It's just the solution to the political military problem here is very suggestive that what was being built was a technology of mass destruction. Well, if you have a commensurate technology, you don't want to start using it and have everybody blow each other up.
Yeah.
So you do it through what? You do it through covert operations.
Well, I wish we
you come down and scramble everybody's, scramble everybody's tongues, and they can't understand each other. I wish we could
use that in Washington.
Well, I think they're well on their way.
Yeah. That's classic. Oh, gosh. Oh, Joseph.
Well, look, which of these yahoos, dummy crooks and Republic thugs, are they listening to each other? No, they can't listen to each other.
Right.
they don't listen to each other. And, they're not even capable of listening to their own allies, other countries anymore. So I think they're well on their way.
Oh,
they're talking their own little language, and everybody else is just like, well, say what?
Yeah. Oh.
No, it's an ingenious story, when you read it carefully and put it into this kind of symbolic technological context.
Yeah.
It's very, very suggestive of power struggles and technologies and covert operations of one sort or another. It's very suggestive.
Well, Nimrod would have had to have been kind of like one of the fallen angels, if you will.
Maybe not.
To have that technology.
Maybe not. We don't know. See, there's another thing. Symbols aren't just things like swastikas and fiery swords and crosses and so on and so forth. They're also names. They're symbolic people that symbolize certain things through history.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to trace how those kinds of symbols change for us. I mean, we live, in this country, in the United States, we live with the symbolism of the Founding Fathers.
Yeah.
And oftentimes it's a shock to people that are only familiar with the symbolic lore and not the historical reality.
Yes.
To find out what the historical reality is.
Yeah.
We live with this, and that's another way. Again, it's, why have these men been epitomized and turned into symbols? Well, symbols do what? They manipulate and are the means of practicing magic. What is magic? Magic is ultimately the way of bending other people to your point of view, to your will,
yes.
to your perception of things.
Yes.
So, like it or not, the modern term is social engineering.
Yes.
But the ancient term is magic.
Yeah, you're right. Right on. Absolutely. Oh my gosh, Joseph. Well,
as for Nimrod maybe being, part human, part God, or Anunnaki, or Nephilim, or whatever, we're not told much about him in the canonical text. He may have been, who knows? A mighty man of renown. Well, that suggests he was a giant, and we in the biblical lore, giants are the offspring of the gods and men.
Mm-hmm.
So who knows? He may have had that kind of special knowledge by dint of that kind of genealogical descent. Who knows? We don't.
There's something else that bothers me, and that is in genetics.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the things that they're doing, they're on record. There are people who have received liver transplants, for example, who have never liked beer.
Right.
And after the transplant,
all of a sudden they have a craving for beer.
Yes. Yes, they wake up and they have this craving. Mm-hmm. Well, they can put genetic information into somebody that would cause them to have memories that didn't actually belong to them.
Well, this is actually not all that unusual a phenomenon. People that have had different kinds of transplants, heart transplants in particular, have reported that they have memories, other people's memories.
Yes.
It's not that unusual, and I do think, crawling out onto the twig of speculation again, I do think that there is some sort of genetic memory that everyone has. That, our memory is not simply locked up in our brains, it's locked up in our cells. Mm-hmm. Our memory ultimately, I think, is non-local. In other words, I think ultimately our memory is something not even physical.
Yes.
But that for whatever reason our DNA kind of transduces it. It accesses it. It pulls it in.
Yeah.
I've thought that for a very long time. And there are a few studies underway that kind of suggest that might be true. Time will tell. But it's not that unusual phenomenon. I suspect that they are secretly, and have been secretly for a long time, studying these types of things.
Yes.
Because, again, it's part of that cosmology of symbolism of the universe as an organism.
Mm-hmm.
If that be the case, and you have this kind of phenomenon popping up, then it's going to be a cause of concern and something that those hidden elites that have that point of view and that outlook are going, by the nature of the case, to want to study.
Mm.
So I suspect, and in the new book I point out that my suspicion that the Genome Project is in part a project with a covert agenda.
Yes.
To look for, so to speak, the bloodline.
Yeah.
The ancient bloodlines.
Yeah.
To determine if there's any truth to these mythologies. And if so, what is the distinguishing genetic characteristic? I mean, is it its own haplogroup? What are we talking about here? Well, it's interesting that you can find studies of geneticists investigating groups that are known since medieval or modern times to have preserved very careful inbreeding with each other.
Yeah.
The European royal families. A couple of years ago, I ran into a study about geneticists investigating the Habsburg family genome. And they found remarkable consistency in the family over time and over space.
Mm-hmm.
Another group that I mentioned in this book that's coming out is they have done a study of the Jewish Kohanim, the priestly line in Jewish families where religious tradition states that they have to maintain that bloodline very carefully. Well, the genetic information suggests that that's precisely what they did, and that they have done so over a very long time.
Yeah.
So, I think those are little clues and indicators that there may be deeper things going on with all of these genetic investigations of human origins and bloodlines and so on and so forth. But there's no real, it's suggestive, but it's not proof. It's not hard and fast evidence. And one of the things they may be investigating as a result of those kinds of studies, well, okay, what are the genetic memories of these groups?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Is there some sort of set of concepts that these groups have among themselves that have some relation to genetic memory? And if so, how would we go about testing that? I suspect, again, that they're doing that they just haven't been telling us.
Yes. Well, like these traffic stops where they want your blood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like what are they looking for?
Yeah.
I maintain that this is something much more than just taking everybody's DNA samples.
Yes.
So that they can build up a database.
Yep.
I think they're looking for something.
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, they're for whatever reason, I don't know. I suspect it has something to do with this. Mm. But it's part of that symbolic outlook, that esoteric tradition, which I do think does operate at a very high level within the power elites, and I mean very high.
Yes.
And it's very hidden. That's an opinion. I don't have anything other than suggestive evidence of that. But I do think that there's enough evidence to suggest it, and therefore that you have to hold open the possibility, which I certainly do.
Well, everybody will get a big laugh out of this, but these scanners that they have at airports?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I think the real reason that they're doing that is to look for people without skeletons. without skeletal structure.
Or with a different kind of anatomical or skeletal structure. That could be.
Possibly.
That could be. I hold open all these kinds of possibilities as well. There seems to be some big, huge program of looking for something.
Mm-hmm.
One telltale thing, since you've shared your wild speculation, let me embroider it with a few Baroque filigrees and cartouches.
Oh, brother. Fancy stuff.
The Russian astrophysicist Nikolai Kozyrev that I wrote about in The Philosopher's Stone, he was fascinated with the idea of time as an actual physical force, okay? And in his speculations, in his writings, you can run across the idea that there is a direction of time. There is a rotational moment to the time signature of this universe that we live in.
Yes.
In other words, if you can imagine the universe as a big clock, okay, what he's really saying is that the clock of our universe and all objects in it, for the most part, tends to run clockwise.
Yeah.
Okay? But he maintained that if you had a universe with time running in a different direction, it would affect the rotation moment.
Oh.
And that the signature, therefore, would be organisms in such a universe would possibly have a counterclockwise, so to speak, direction. And I'm really, I hope people understand here, I'm really oversimplifying what he's saying, okay, just to kind of draw the picture for people of how profound his speculations really were. So what this means, and he comes right out somewhere in one of his papers and says this, that what this means is that organs inside the body would be shifted. Oh. Organs that are on the right would be on the left. In other words, our liver's on the right, but someone coming from a different sort of time construct would have them reversed.
Yes.
So, going to your airport scanners, could they be looking for someone with a signature of something that's out of phase with this universe?
Very possible.
Possibly, if you start entertaining the idea that they're looking for things in this respect, then you have to speculate and hold open all sorts of wild and crazy hypotheses. So that would be one of them. But I do think, getting back to this symbolic organic cosmology, that given all the little suggestions in some of the genetic literature, I think they're looking for something. They're not just taking swabs to pop them into some big federal data bank so that the Genome Project can press on with all of its crazy ideas. I think they're looking for something. And perhaps they know what they're looking for, and they're simply trying to sort people by whatever criterion it is that, they hold in secret. I don't know. Time will tell.
Well, like that Arsenal. Was it Redstone Arsenal?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's Redstone.
Yeah. Look at what they're studying.
What are they studying? Refresh my memory here. They're studying lots of things.
Yeah, they're studying the curl of a man's hair swishes one way.
Oh yeah, you're talking about what we talked about in transhumanism.
Yes.
Oh, that's not Redstone. That's
what is that?
That's Oak Ridge.
Oak Ridge.
Yeah.
Okay.
They're studying tongue curling, ear wiggling, perfect pitch, homosexuality, and alcoholism. That's an interesting list.
and our tax money is paying for these crazy things.
Yeah, why are they studying all this?
Yeah, why?
What's the marker? I can't wiggle my ears, but I can curl my tongue. why are they studying all this? I don't know. Like I say, that's such an odd list that there's got to be some sort of principle that is underlying it that they're not really very forthcoming about. I don't think just studies of molecular biology peculiarities are a sufficient explanation. Otherwise, they wouldn't be studying, the Habsburgs and the Romanovs and the Bourbon-Poissons and Jewish priestly lines and
Yeah, exactly.
They're looking for something. I definitely think. In the new book, one of the things that people will discover once it's out is that I put enough dots in that book for people to connect. I think that will clearly suggest, and they kind of have to be believers in the Warren Commission not to see this. They'd have to be willfully blind people like certain news anchors that came out with their defenses of the Warren Commission on network television.
Absolutely.
Whose ridiculous comments, to save them and their families from further embarrassment, I won't mention their names. Some of them are still on TV ranting and raving their stupidity. So, to save them the embarrassment, I won't mention their names.
Okay.
But there's enough details about these families and the actual real intermarriages and coincidental connections, and put coincidental connections in quotation marks, for people to see that there at least is some truth, whatever it is, to the meme that's out there in the New Age alternative research community that these bloodlines very carefully have preserved themselves over the centuries, and particularly in the Middle Ages. It's very clear that this is going on, that this is something moving behind and shaping the history behind the scenes. So would they still be doing this in modern times? Would they still be looking for confirmation of their bloodline myths in modern times by dint of modern science? You betcha. Of course they would. Of course they would. And would they be sneaky and clever enough to have us pay for it? Sure they would.
Yeah, of course.
Of course they would.
We're stupid.
Well, I don't know if we're stupid so much as just, rendered more or less powerless. But, I won't even go there. I'll tell you that little tidbit after we quit recording. I was stunned, in fact, when I read something in one of these books that just kind of made me swallow. I'll tell you off the air.
Can't you tell us now?
No, I don't want to do that.
Oh, okay.
It's for your ears only.
Oh, dear. Well, we know that they're looking for something, and only they know what they're looking for. The cop that's running the swab in the person's mouth has no idea.
No.
The idiots running those cancer-causing machines at the airport, they don't know. They don't know nothing.
No.
It's like a huge conglomeration of data that they go through and they sort through.
Now, let's stop there, if I may.
Okay.
You are exactly correct. It's a huge conglomeration of data. Now, how would you crunch the data? How would you go through and analyze all that? You couldn't do it. You couldn't do it without two things. You would have to have, first of all, an enormous and detailed historical genealogical database.
Yes.
Okay? The second thing you would absolutely have to have is a very, very large supercomputer computational technology.
Yes.
And the third thing you would require is the software, the algorithm, the architecture to crunch all that data and search through it and sift for what you're looking for.
Absolutely.
Now, that immediately implies that you are dealing with some version of the national security complex.
Yeah, yeah.
It immediately implies you're dealing with big computers.
Yeah.
And historical databases.
Yeah.
Can we say Utah Data Center?
Well, Joseph, there's this ad on TV, Ancestry.com.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
you know.
write to us or click on this and fill us out, and we will send you a DNA kit.
Bingo. That's, again, you're there. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because all that is data mining.
Yes.
It's data mining.
Yes. And so do the Mormons.
Well, of course.
They have one of the largest
That's what I was referring to, historical genealogical database. Who's got it? Well, the Mormon Church does.
Yep.
I strongly suspect that you find similar databases, probably just familial within certain families. Certainly, a similar database existed in Venice with the Golden Book of, who's noble families and who aren't noble families. And even there in Venice, there was the clear distinction between the Longi, in other words, people of ancient noble provenance, and then the Curti, the new, nouveau riche.
Yes. Yes.
Venice kept that, and kept it quite openly. So, the databases exist, and the problem, as I pointed out, since we're talking again about symbols and history, the problem there is, as something I pointed out in the new book coming out, that records of these types of things don't begin to be kept in Western Europe until about the 9th century.
Oh, my.
So, in other words, there is this historical gap from the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, about 400 to 500 years, to the very beginnings of this, and even then it's not widespread. It really takes the Italian city-states and then, nation-states like France or England, once they get started and become more or less stable political entities, then they start keeping these types of public records. So, the place that you would naturally find any information like that would be in family tradition and archives. And again, those are private. So you're thrown back on another symbol. Here we go. You're thrown back to another symbol. Guess what the symbol is? Heraldry.
Yes.
Heraldry.
Yes.
Heraldry is the symbolic way of showing what your family is. By dint of family colors, the various little symbols on, various arms, coats of arms. When they intermarry, then of course the arms are amended or altered in some fashion to reflect the union of two families, and so on and so forth. So heraldry is kind of that missing record in some cases. It can't be looked at as conclusive because it's kind of murky. Sometimes you have unrelated families using the same types of arms, that type of thing. But there are certain features that are consistent, and therefore you have to start looking at all the very, heraldry as well as I do is an extraordinarily complex symbolic language all of its own.
Oh, yeah.
And you have to start looking at that to see how these things kind of flow through history. So it's, you're dealing not only with different symbols over time, you're dealing with different types of records as a result of it. That's the other problem here. But isn't it interesting that during that period, families identify themselves with symbols?
Yes. Yes, it is.
And that, again, in my opinion, tends to suggest the possibility that you're also looking at a hidden cosmology in operation in those families, or at least some of those families, that is not the cosmology of the public religion, which of course is Latin Christianity. So, you're dealing with all sorts of stuff here, folks. It's very complex.
Oh, yikes. Joseph, this is such a huge subject.
Well, of course it is. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, my gosh, it goes everywhere.
It goes everywhere. Yes, it does. It does.
Oh.
It connects, in my opinion. I'll just be very blunt. In my opinion, it connects to this whole big cosmic war scenario in some form or fashion. It connects to this whole idea of ancient technologies that were only capable of being activated in the presence of certain people or in physical contact with them. You know, that theory that I outlined in Cosmic War. It goes to the idea that technologies have been suppressed, that technologies have been hidden, that people are looking for things, you know, throughout the Middle Ages, and they're not telling us what they're looking for, and if they find them, they're really not telling us. And it goes to all of the mythologies that something was found, and then it was hidden, and it was hidden in France, or hidden in Scotland, or hidden in Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
All the places.
Exactly.
All of these things supposedly were hidden. Yeah. I'll have to wait for the new book to come out.
Oh, boy.
And for me to get done with this paper I'm writing now, too, I think I know what some of these things might have been. But speculation again. But I don't want to talk about it until I get done.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, boy. Well, the Bible is filled with symbols.
Oh, absolutely.
Just crammed full with symbols.
The Bible, the Quran, the Kabbalah, you know, all of, symbols galore.
Yeah. And people say, well, that's the Word of God. And that mystifies me because it isn't, actually. In some places, maybe, but not the whole book.
Well, you know, I don't want to get into theological discussions of, you know, biblical inspiration and all of that. All of that just kind of, for me, is rather pointless. The problem I have always had with any form of Christianity of that sort is that it is ignoring a fundamental statement in their own canonical Gospels, which occurs in St. John.
Okay.
And that is that the Word of God isn't a book, it's a person.
Yes.
It's Christ, it's not a book.
Yes, exactly.
You know, and don't have people emailing, you know, all Scripture is inspired of God, blah, blah, blah. You know, I know all these Bible verses, I know all the Princeton theology and the Calvinists and the Lutherans and the Tridentine Council and all various versions of this. I don't need theology lessons here. I don't want to receive any.
I know.
I don't want to receive any. My problem has always been that. Even in my church days, I was much more interested in the person rather than the book.
Yes, absolutely. And if they would pay attention to what that person said, this would be a much better world.
That too.
Yeah.
That too.
Yeah.
But, you know, for me, texts are texts. You know, the Bible is like any other text. You have to look at context, history, other texts from that period, look at parallel memes, look at parallel symbols, how are they handled, you know.
Yeah.
It's a huge, complex thing, you know, and I get people all the time, well, why don't you write a book about the Bible? Well, if any, and I've said this over and over again, people have no idea, really, literally, have no idea how complex the field of biblical scholarship really is.
Oh, yeah.
It's just enormous. There's so much literature that it's beyond any one individual, PhD or no, to absorb it all. It's just, and on top of this, the languages alone that you have to have mastery of.
Yeah.
You know, Hebrew, Aramaic, Akkadian, Assyrian, Sumerian, Coptic, Latin, Greek.
Yeah.
It's a daunting thing. And, I'm rather hesitant to even get involved in trying to come up with a macro book like that. And I may eventually do it, but, with the caveat that, in neon lights flashing on and off, this is all huge speculation, folks,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you have an enormous amount of knowledge of history and the intricacies, just so much, Joseph. Another question that was asked is, what was the original language of the book of Genesis?
The original language? Well, that's another problem.
Oh, dear.
The language is one thing, text is another. The language of the text is Hebrew. It's the Masoretic Hebrew text.
Yeah.
That text itself, the Masoretic text, is a text that the Jewish rabbis at the Council of Jamnia more or less codified or finalized circa 70 A.D. The exact date I can't pull out of my head for some reason at the moment. But this is where you get into problems. Language of a text is one thing, but what the original language of the stories in the text were may have been something very different.
Yes.
That's problem number one. Problem number two is, the other edition of the Old Testament text, the Greek Septuagint, is in many respects very different in certain books from the Masoretic text.
Yes.
Then you have all the different theories as to when exactly and under what circumstances were these books written. And trust me, the theories out there in biblical scholarship are, there's of course the documentary hypothesis, which is sort of like the theory of evolution. In other words, the hypothesis is taught to the public, and it's taught in upper levels of baccalaureate degrees and then on into graduate degree in seminaries. But you soon learn that even biblical scholars have many, many problems with the documentary hypothesis, just like behind the scenes evolutionists have problems with this or that aspect of the theory, and they're big problems, so they don't talk about them, and they continue to kind of push the macro theory to the public, okay?
Yes.
We're not privy to the internecine debates within the discipline. And this is going on, trust me, in biblical literature. Then, on top of all of this, you have a body of, for want of a better expression, New Age or alternative research community scholarship that is suggesting very peculiar dates pushing certain events of the Old Testament much further back in history than even the documentary hypothesis or even conservative evangelical scholarship would admit. And then, on the other hand, you have more recent studies that are tying some books of the Bible to the King's Lists, and in other words, pushing the composition of the text much closer to our modern times than even the documentary hypothesis. So, you've got all these trends out there, and all these scholarly arguments going back and forth, and then the archaeologists weigh in, and that becomes a problem because do you accept the broad paleontological tradition of academic archaeology? Well, there are some archaeologists that don't. I can think of Michael Michael Cremo and Richard Thompson that have challenged so much of the academic school book archaeology that people are taught. So, the more layers of complexity you add, the more complex it becomes to sort out the chronological problem. And, that's one reason, the reason, in fact, that in Cosmic War, that book, I left the chronological details very much in the air. You know, I painted in a very, very broad chronological brush.
Yes.
And even then tried to remind people this is very speculative, because the chronological questions are just immense. They're huge, and the more data you add, the more complex and difficult it becomes to sort out. And inevitably, anyone attempting to sit down and do a detailed chronology like that is inevitably going to have to, you know, as my Old Testament professor said decades ago to our class, you pays your money and you takes your choice. In other words, if you come down on one side, then there's going to be a certain school out there that is defending another hypothesis, and they're going to pounce on you like rugby players in a rugby game.
Yeah.
So, you know, and I don't, you know, I'm not a polemicist. I'm not a very good debater. I don't, you know, I put things out there and move along. I don't like to spend all my time defending everything I've ever said.
Well,
I've got too many other things I want to write.
Yeah, I know. I know. Well, where did the Hebrews get their ideas from? Because they...
Egypt.
Yeah. Yeah.
Egypt in some cases, and Mesopotamia in other cases. And that's a very interesting question, because I go back to an observation that was made by Paracelsus, of all people. Since we're talking in terms of esotericism and symbols, he wrote, and I forgot right off the top of my head, I forget what treatise, I cite and refer to this in the Philosopher's Stone somewhere. He wrote his observation that if you look at the Hebrews, it appears that this ancient lore, the three basic systems of esotericism, which are alchemy, Kabbalah, and astrology.
Yeah.
He wrote that if you look at what this lore is, it appears that it was all part of one thing at some time. And when he says this, he's not really saying anything all that unusual, because this is the view of most of those Renaissance Hermeticists. You know, from Cosimo de' Medici and Pico della Mirandola and Giordano Bruno, Francesco Zorzi, all of these Renaissance Hermeticists are looking at this body of esoteric traditions, and they're all coming to more or less the same conclusion. What we're looking at are fragments of something that once belonged together, and they attempt, many of them, to reconstruct what they think that original synthesis was.
Yeah.
You see this very clearly in Giordano Bruno. You see it very clearly in Cornelius Agrippa. You see it in most of these Christian Hermeticists during the Renaissance. You see it in Francesco Zorzi, and on I could go. So they're trying, you know, his Paracelsus' observation here isn't all that unusual. What is unusual is what he suggests that the Hebrews were. And I picked up on this and mentioned this briefly, I think, in one of my early books. I can't recall off the top of my head which one. It was either Cosmic War, Philosopher's Stone, or one of the Giza Death Star books. But when you take what Paracelsus says, what he also suggests, what he's clearly implying in the quotation that I cite in the Philosopher's Stone, is that the Hebrews move back and forth constantly in their history, as it's recounted in the Old Testament. They move constantly back and forth between Egypt and Babylon.
Yes.
Or Mesopotamia.
Yeah.
And what he's suggesting is that they're trying to themselves reassemble these different fragments, alchemy from Egypt and astrology from Babylon, with their own Kabbalah, you know, their own tradition of combinatorial phonetics and so on and so forth that plays such a role in Kabbalah.
Yeah.
So what he's suggesting is that someone is pushing them back and forth to these two regions, trying to reassemble this. And, that's a whopper.
Yeah.
That's huge. If that's true, it's a huge statement. It's the implications of that just ripple out through the centuries.
Well, from the time of Adam until the first Hebrew, how many years passed?
Well, I don't know. You've got...
It's more than 1,000.
You've got all sorts there are problems, as anyone knows about the numbers in the Old Testament.
Yes.
There's Archbishop Usher and his famous biblical chronology, taking all those numbers and adding them up and coming to a date. Well, the earth began 4,004 years ago on a Wednesday afternoon at such and such a time. And he's literally that specific.
Oh, brother. Oh, my gosh.
That chronology went by the wayside. There's another book by Tila that I studied way back when I was in college. It was called The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings, where he attempted to look at these numbers and come up with a resolution of the dilemma. There's all sorts of problems, and then the problems with that chronology are amplified when you put it into the context of the Sumerian kings list, which you think the wives in the Bible of those old guys is long. Just look at the Sumerian kings list.
Yeah, that's right.
There's all sorts of problems. I'm not and have never been. Once again, I'll be very clear. I'm not and I've never been an evangelical conservative or a fundamentalist on these things. I don't believe the earth is 4,000 years old.
Yeah, I don't either.
All sorts of stuff. I don't believe the earth is really flat and that, modern science has been lying to us that the earth is circling around the sun.
Yeah. There's people that believe that.
Oh, tell me about it. I had one post on my Facebook wall a couple days ago.
Oh, my gosh.
I thought, oh, come on, please.
Oh, Joseph.
And, believe it or not, some of them are sophisticated enough that they will actually point out, well, all this belief is due to the effects of that satanic hermeticism that's running around because, of course, Nicholas Copernicus pays deliberate and explicit reference to the Hermetica at the beginning of his treatise, So there you go. Copernican system is satanic, it's esoteric, it's black magic.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, it's true. Copernicus does mention the Hermetica. But,
Gosh.
It doesn't mean that his system is satanic.
Right. Gee whiz. Oh.
It gets so kooky, Georgianne, sometimes that I just have to throw up my hands in despair. I don't have time to sit here. If people are that convinced, nothing I say is going to convince them,
Well, they're just looking for an argument.
Yeah, they're looking for an argument, and I don't have time for it.
No, you spend your time more productively.
Yeah, I don't have the energy either.
Yeah. Oh.
But, the problem of again, you're hitting up against the problem of chronology here. How do we take these texts seriously on the one hand in terms of what they're saying about historical events, and yet on the other hand take seriously enough the findings of archaeology and other research that people have done and come up with a harmonious synthesis of the two.
Right.
That's literally what biblical scholarship has been trying to do for the last 2.5 centuries. And by the same token, all of this alternative research crowd. And the bottom line is that nobody, not me, not anyone else, really has the final solution to all of this. We're groping around in the darkly, trying to piece all this together. I think that's why it's very important, at least at this juncture, to maintain kind of a broad paintbrush approach, or if you want to get into detailed types of reconstructions, this happened at this year and that happened at that year, and the Old Testament says this, and that compares to Manetho that, and Sumerian Kings list this. When you get into that kind of reconstruction, you have to let people know that this is speculation again.
Yes.
This is an argument. This is one way of looking at things. There are others.
Yes.
That chronology, that kind of very skeletal chronology I put in Cosmic War is the same thing. It's a skeleton, and the superstructure there, the scaffolding, may be wildly inaccurate. So, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Like my old professor says, you pays your money and you takes your choice.
Oh, boy. Oh, Joseph. The whole thing is so fascinating. And,
it is.
And
yeah, I'll grant you that.
It's fascinating. It's huge.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if we will ever have the answers.
Well, let's put it, I'm in agreement with you, but I think the problem here is that when I say paint on a large canvas, this to me is the principal problem of people who are looking at a particular textual tradition, be it biblical or otherwise.
Yeah.
Because what I think people have to start doing, and it's only, I don't see this being done or coming out of academia. I really don't.
Oh, no.
Eventually it will. Eventually it will make its way into academia. There are a few little glimmers and signs of it here and there that it might be. But I think that people have to start looking at all human traditions of human origins and history, be they Chinese, Japanese, Vedic, Incan, Mayan, North American, Indian, Greek, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, ancient Russian,
right.
pre-Christian Russian legends, Scandinavian myth, Celtic, Irish myth, and so on.
Yes.
African tribes. I think we have to start thinking in terms of the big picture.
Mm-hmm.
This is one big human family, and let's start treating it like this, and start comparing notes rather than saying, well, this tradition is canonically true, and everything else, has to be squared with this.
Yeah.
That approach isn't really going to, in my opinion, solve much.
Well, it's caused wars.
It's caused wars. It's caused suffering.
Yes.
I think we have to take the big picture and we have to start comparing notes carefully.
Yeah.
I do talk about biblical texts in my books, but not in any special attention or any way that focus. Yeah, in other words, I'm looking at Mesopotamian things, I'm looking at Egyptian things, but even that context really is rather limited when you look at the surface of the globe and realize that there are other traditions out there that are talking about the same thing, and oftentimes in very similar terms. And then the question becomes why, and what does it really mean? I think that's part of the picture. And quite frankly, I'm still, and I don't mean to keep going around Harvey's barn here, but I'm still of the opinion that we also have to consider all of the evidence, the suggestive pictures and so on from outer space in the solar system and reckon that into our accounting of this story.
Absolutely.
And that, again, that changes the picture. Are all of those legends, biblical and otherwise, about wars of the gods, falls of Lucifer, rebellions, are all of these things true? And I think there's a fundamental truth to them.
Yeah.
So, that's saying by the same token, you don't take the Bible and throw it out either.
Yeah.
I think you have to be very cautious but at the same time, you're not so cautious that you can't speculate, because that doesn't get you anywhere.
Right. Well, you and I've talked about this before, that the Bible is the elite's playbook.
In a certain sense, I think it is.
Yes.
I think, and again, why? Why would you take any text, ancient text like that,
and
make it a playbook? Well, One reason is that you're operating with a cosmology that's fundamentally different than the public. You're operating with this cosmology of symbols, of memes, of magic, of prophecies, and so on. You're operating in that worldview.
Yes.
And therefore, the easiest way, and I'll go back to what we said in Yahweh, the Two-Faced God, Dr. DeHart and I, the easiest way to fulfill prophecy is to control the interpretation of it.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, Joseph.
That's what they're doing, And in the new book, what I also try and show is that you had a similar mentality. Believe it or not, you had a similar mentality at work, operating behind the scenes in the first voyage of Christopher Columbus. Yeah. Prophecies were being manipulated. They were there. They were being manipulated. They were being, memes were being driven. There was social engineering taking place to prepare people for this big revelation.
Oh boy.
It's not that people in Europe didn't know about the New World. I mean, for crying out loud, Saint Isidore of Seville, back in early medieval Spain, wrote about it.
Wow. Oh, gee.
So it's not that this was unknown. It was just the public forgot it. The knowledge of it was maintained by the elites that could read, and could read these people. Raymond Lull, another, believe it or not, another one of these early Christian High Middle Ages Hermeticists,
yes,
wrote about the New World, and he did so on the basis of what to him was scientific speculation. He just looked and he said, okay, water has to be contained.
Yeah.
Water has boundaries. So here on this side of the Atlantic, we see the shorelines, and that's the boundary of the water. This must mean that there is a boundary over there somewhere.
Yes.
Okay.
Very smart man.
Yeah, just like over here,
Yeah.
So this was in, I think, the 14th century. Don't quote me here. I don't remember the dates of Raymond Lull right off the top of my head. But, all of this is known. Mm-hmm. All of this is known. And there is, as I point out, there's definitely an argument to be made, and I made it in Financial Vipers of Venice, that there was a cartographic tradition floating around in medieval Europe that clearly depicted the New World.
Yes, and
that Columbus used it and knew about it.
Yeah, and there's a map.
Sure, there's maps.
Yes, and there's also a map that shows the Antarctic with no ice.
The Piri Reis map, the Turkish admiral's map. Well, where is this coming from?
Yeah.
How do we get a Turkish admiral, showing a continent that hasn't even been discovered yet, and showing it more or less accurately?
Yeah.
And showing the coastline of South America.
Yeah.
We have all of these indicators that there's a cartographic tradition and that people are utilizing it prior to Columbus's voyage of, quote, discovery, unquote.
Yeah.
And, and Piri Reis makes it very clear. I point out in Financial Vipers of Venice, Piri Reis makes it very clear that Columbus knew this tradition and utilized it.
Yeah.
So in other words, it's not a voyage of discovery, it's a voyage of revelation.
Yep.
It's social engineering.
Yeah. It certainly was.
It certainly was.
Oh, boy, Joe.
So, the real question is, okay, let's assume in this symbolic universe, hidden tradition, hidden knowledge, talk about a replay of today. What were they doing in those centuries prior to Columbus's voyage? What were they doing with the New World?
Yeah, what?
What were they doing? I'm not going to tell. But, again, it's a symbolic universe. It's esoteric, hidden knowledge. It's keeping the knowledge hidden until, quote, the time is right. Well, what made the time right? Well, prophecy.
Yeah.
Prophecy. Agenda.
Yes.
This is the old system we're looking at, folks. And whether we like it or not, whether the system is true or not, isn't the question. The question is, if there are people who believe that this system is true, and they are in positions of power, then that is why it's important. It's important because it's forming the perceptions of powerful people.
Yes, yes. Oh my goodness.
It's part of their decision making culture.
Well,
and that culture is hidden from us. It's if I can use the expression, it's a breakaway civilization.
Yes.
And if that be the case, they have their own culture, and that informs their decision-making process. So in order to understand that process, whether we believe the system that they think is true or not, we have to understand the system in order to understand why and how they're taking their policy decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing, I just blogged about this, the interesting thing is it appears to me that this whole Renaissance social engineering voyage of Columbus, revelation of the New World model, may be operating again.
Yes.
Right now.
With Mars.
With all of the stuff regarding space.
Yeah.
Just to give you an example, Russia Today published an article. Again, thank you, Russia Today, for telling us what our own space agency is doing.
Yes, isn't that amazing?
Isn't that amazing? They published an article about some scientists, I think at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory or some NASA-affiliated space agency, has come out and done a study of Jupiter's moon Ganymede. Okay?
Yeah.
And what they're saying is that Ganymede looks like it has a strange, multi-layered geophysical composition. It has the surface regolith, then underneath that there's an ocean, and then underneath that another regolith, and then underneath that another ocean, and so on and so forth.
Oh my goodness!
Like layers in an onion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, why are they talking about that?
Yeah.
What really are they saying here? They just put it out there, and you can go on Russia Today and look at this article, and you can see the onion skins of Ganymede peeled back with all the layers of regolith and ocean, okay? So it looks like, a big onion.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking at this, and I'm thinking, insulation. Why? Water maintains heat.
Yeah.
It's the most efficient maintainer of heat.
Mm-hmm.
So you layer, you're looking at layered insulation.
Oh my goodness. My goodness.
And, talk about, I'm not saying that this is an artificial object. I'm just saying what an interesting, ingenious, intriguing thing for an artificial object in space to have.
Yeah.
To preserve heat.
Yeah.
To, absorb energy from the planet Jupiter that it's next door to. And, the other strange thing is Jupiter's giving off more energy than it's getting from the sun. Well, where is it coming from, folks?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, are we looking at just another little subtle indicator, another little bit of possible disclosure, or are we looking at a natural object that is so strange that we have to revisit all of our theories of planetary formation? Who knows?
Boy.
But I just looked at that and I thought, gee, that's very strange, and given all the other weird space news last month, it's a strange thing to come out and release.
Wow.
So yeah, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. You pays your money and takes your choice.
Yeah, gee, Joseph. Well, all these little dribbles and bits of finding planets that could possibly support human life.
Mm-hmm.
They're just kind of dribbling this stuff out.
Yeah, they're dribbling and drabbling it out. Yes, isn't that funny?
Yeah, it is funny.
And the Vatican's in on the game now.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, oh, my goodness, we can go here, and we're going to send people there. And I think we already have.
Well, it could be. There's, again, symbolism, the symbolic cosmology operates in a very unique way publicly because that's the way it operates. It dribs and drabs and dangles out this and dangles out that, and, you never know if you're supposed to take it seriously or not.
Yeah.
I suspect that, I'll pay my money and make my choice here. I suspect that this is all kind of a slow drip time release, very deliberately so.
Oh yeah.
I don't think any of it's coincidental. But Bolden, the head of NASA, recently, and I blogged about this last week, recently made the statement, well, we've got to go to Mars by the year 2030 because human survival depends on it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Oh,
yeah,
gee.
It does. Why? Are we going to run out of oil and gas and everything else in the next 15 years? I don't think so.
Are we going to destroy the planet?
Are we going to destroy the planet? Why is it necessary for us to go to Mars in 16 years?
Yeah.
That's a rather, if you're dealing in the timetable of chemical rockets, that's kind of a dramatic timetable.
Yeah.
We haven't even been back to the moon yet. No one's been back to the moon on the surface of the moon except China.
That we know of.
Well, that we know of. Again, that's the codicil or rubric under which I want people to understand all this.
Yeah.
That's my point. It's looking to me like we're looking at the Renaissance thing replaying itself. Hidden technologies, hidden knowledge, hidden commerce with a new world, so to speak, and now there's slowly talking about it and dripping it out into the serious mainstream public media. That to me is kind of significant.
Oh yeah.
Don't write and say, "Oh, Dr. Farrell, you've sold out to the ET disclosure bandwagon." No, I'm not saying that. I'm looking at the parallels that I think may be in play with this Renaissance model. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is because of something else that you and I have talked about, and that is this hidden system of finance that I believe very early on was put into play and argued that it was put into play in 1947 by President Truman using Axis loot with space and whatever was found out there as the collateral.
Oh, boy.
And, that's the Venetian model.
Gee. Good grief.
Mm-hmm. These people study history.
Oh, yeah.
They study their own history.
Yep.
And for a purpose. It's to figure out how to handle things like this.
Mm. Well, did people rise up in rebellion when Columbus left on his voyage?
No. Contrary to the Brookings Report, they were not ready to proclaim the end of civilization.
Right. See? Pooey on the Brookings Report.
The Brookings Report did rightly point out that the contact with Europe of the Native American population in North and South America was disastrous because, those civilizations simply did not have the technology to match what the Europeans had.
Yeah.
So, they were correct in pointing out that contact of that nature could be damaging if you're on the low end of the technological spectrum in commerce with something that is at the high end. That was their concern.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the concern that drove all of this hidden system that we've seen in play since the end of World War II. I think that is why you have this culture of fear emanating out of the national security establishment. It's coming from that.
Ha-ha.
Ha-ha.
Why would they be fearful?
Well, think of the movie Independence Day. The aliens show up and park their big saucers over our cities and blast them to ruins. There wasn't much we could do about it.
Yeah.
You know, and think back of to Cortez and the Aztecs. Well, you know, Montezuma welcomes him, and again, it's fulfillment of prophecy. You see, because that's what the Aztecs thought. Mm-hmm. White bearded men, you know, Quetzalcoatl that founded their civilization. Well, they're back.
Yeah, they're back.
They're back.
Yeah.
And you know, Cortez and his men literally take over the Aztec Empire simply because they have superior firepower.
And Bishop Landra ordered all their manuscripts destroyed. But I don't think they destroyed them. I think they're in the Vatican.
I think a lot of them went there. Bishop Landra himself actually later repented of his act and decided that he'd better start writing down a bunch of these Aztec myths, which he did. You know, the Madrid Codex and other things are evidence that some of that made their way back to Europe. So, I tend to think that maybe some of it made its way secretly.
Yeah.
And the reason I think that is once you see the new book come out and see the hidden agendas in play and all the scratching around for hidden knowledge and hidden archives and hidden objects of power, and then once they find them, they try and hide them again.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, gee.
It's a huge story.
Well, Joseph, like the beheadings of 100,000 people or 80,000 people in one day, there were a lot of people there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And if they wanted it stopped, they could have stopped it.
Oh, yeah. The Spanish, you know, the Spanish military men, the conquistadors, were very, very clever in their tactics and their military deception practices that they used on the Aztecs. And again, you see the same thing going on with Pizarro and the Incas. Mm-hmm. You know, it's rather breathtaking to see what Spain did in terms of establishing this huge empire with a minimum, I mean, just a breathtaking minimum of military involvement. You know, stop and think of the huge landmass that almost instantly became subject to Madrid on the basis of this breathtaking military machine that they put together. It just boggles the mind. And like you, I tend to think that much of the native knowledge made its way back to Europe.
Oh, boy.
And, you know, I'm suspicious anymore, Georgianne, of any public story. Yeah. Be it the Warren Commission or be it stories, well, we melted all that stuff down because it was just offerings and sacrifices to idols and satanic, and we melted it down, can't have any of that. I'm sure that went on. It did go on. You know, there were book burnings and so on. But I think some of that at least had to have made its way back to Europe. You know, the Spanish aren't fools.
No.
No.
They have never been accused of that.
No. And particularly not at that time.
What about the Knights Templar?
What about them?
What was it that they could have discovered that would cause the Vatican to order a simultaneous killing of them?
Well, that's in the new book, partly.
Oh.
Hang on.
Okay.
And what I'm writing right now for the members area in the website is, you know, I intended the new book to be the hidden text of the Financial Vipers of Venice.
Yeah.
This little paper I'm trying to write right now and put in my members area is the hidden text of the hidden text. Okay. It deals directly with that question. Because the speculation here is a kind of dot connecting that is highly speculative, but hugely significant if true. Yeah. All right, what did the Templars find? The Templars, if you look at them, are allied. What are the Templars? Well, first of all, they are the world's first international military, industrial, intelligence, finance complex.
Oh, my goodness.
That's really what they are.
And two guys riding on a donkey.
And two guys, yeah, they're a symbol of two guys riding, on a donkey.
Yeah.
But what they really are, they're an international order. In other words, they're spread all over Europe and in the Middle East, okay,
yeah.
and all throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, the Greek islands, and eventually, after the Fourth Crusade, the remnants of the Byzantine Empire and so on and so forth. So, they're spread all over.
Yeah.
So what you're looking at is the only other Western international bureaucracy besides the Church.
Yes.
And like the Church, it is an international intelligence gathering operation. It's also something unique for the first time in European history since the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. It's the first international, professional, standing army since the end of the Roman Empire in Western Europe. It is an international banking fraternity, which means, therefore, it had to have sophisticated methods of accounting.
Yeah.
The public version of the story is double entry accounting was invented in Venice.
Uh-huh.
Well, Venice, guess what? Venice just happened to be the traditional ally of guess who? The Templars. Because the Venetians were the ones that usually built their fleets.
Oh, my gosh.
Okay? With me?
Yeah.
So in other words, whenever you think Templars, you have to also think Venice. Okay?
Oh, boy.
So when a Venetian comes up and invents double entry accounting and exposes the secret, this is after the demise of the Templars. I think the Venetians get it from the Templars. Okay? Because you can't have international banking without accounting. There's just no way of doing it.
Yeah.
So, the idea that the Templars are sitting around and kind of scratching their illiterate heads and picking lice out of their beards and popping them into their mouth while they're filling out the account books, no. This is a sophisticated operation. It's an international military, industrial, financial intelligence conglomerate. That's what it is.
Wow.
The other thing that you have to remember about the Templars is if this is the case, then it's also the first international mechanism besides the Church itself that is capable of intergenerational liquid capital accumulation. So in other words, you cannot think of the economic boom that begins to happen at the tail end of the Middle Ages in Western Europe without the Templars.
Oh, my goodness.
It would not have been possible.
Oh, my goodness.
So, all that aside, there's one final thing. The Templars are a military. In other words, they have something the Church doesn't. They are the military arm of the papacy. Okay? And therefore, they're a threat. Now, the peculiar thing is that the Templars the original 9 Knights go to the Holy Land, ostensibly to, as we're told by Guillaume de Thiers and other historians of the period, to protect pilgrims.
Yeah.
Now, we'll stop right there. You're surrounded by a sea of really angry Muslims.
Yes.
They're terribly upset that all their holy places have been invaded by all these infidels.
Oh, yeah.
And their idolatrous ways. And you can't blame them.
Right.
And the problem is, 9 Knights is not anywhere near a big enough force to protect pilgrims.
Right.
Okay. So there's another covert purpose. I don't care what any academic historian says about this matter. There's a covert purpose for these guys being there. And they just so happen, Godfrey de Bouillon, the leader of these 9 Knights, turns down the crown of the king of Jerusalem, and Baudouin is elected, and he gives to these 9 Knights the stables off of Solomon's Temple Mount.
Yes.
Okay? And what do? Do they ride around the roads of Palestine protecting pilgrims? No. They dig around for about 9 years.
Yeah.
They dig underneath the Temple Mount. They dig. They're excavating. So in other words, we already know that the real purpose of these guys was they're looking for something.
Yeah.
All right? Now, if they're looking for something, this means they had to have some sort of prior knowledge before they even left Western Europe to go to the Holy Land.
And to go to the stables.
And to go right there, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's prior knowledge, there's hidden knowledge, there's a covert agenda, and after they find all of this stuff, whatever it is that they found, which I'm not telling, I think I know.
Is it in the book?
It's not a book.
No, is it in your book?
Oh, it's sort of suggested in my book.
Oh, dear.
It's sort of suggested. What it is I actually talk about it in Giza Death Star Destroyed.
Oh, dear.
Okay, so in other words, I prepared this a long time ago.
It's a technology.
It's a thing. It's an object. It's, yeah.
Oh.
And other things. I mean, they were looking for other things, too, besides this. But anyway, after they discover this, they return to Europe, and they're fabulously wealthy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so, where did this sudden wealth come from? All right?
Mm-hmm.
The standard lines are either they found portions of the temple treasure that the Jews had buried around there prior to the Roman invasions. I don't think that's very plausible for reasons I get into in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Or they blackmailed the church, which would be a motivation for the papacy to get rid of these people.
Yeah.
Now, here's the interesting part of the story. And, talk about symbolism, folks. Talk about symbolism inviting you to read between the lines.
Yeah.
Okay? Here's where we get interesting. When the Templars began all of their building projects in Europe, including apparently sponsoring in some cases the building of these enormous Gothic cathedrals.
Yes.
The question then becomes, where did they learn how to do this? Okay?
Mm-hmm.
That's the first thing. The second thing is, why is a crusading order that is helping the kings and queens of Aragon and Castile and so on drive the Moors out of Spain and crusading in the Holy Land, why is this same order building these big, huge projects?
Yeah.
Okay, what's the point here?
Uh-huh.
It would be like the Pentagon stepping into Tulsa and saying, we want to build a big cathedral here.
Oh, boy.
You see the problem.
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't fit.
Right.
So there's that question. When they're doing this, most of the Templar assets, physical landed assets in Western Europe, are concentrated, guess where?
Mm.
In the Languedoc of France.
Oh, yes.
In Cathar country.
Yes.
Okay? Now, it's obvious in one military sense why that would be necessary, because they are also, the other part of the Templars' crusading activity, is that they're not just involved in the Middle East, they're involved in Spain. They're involved in all of those campaigns to drive the Moors out of Spain.
Yes.
Okay, so you need lines of supply, you need fortresses through France, down in over the Pyrenees into Spain so that you can do this. So that makes sense, okay?
Yeah.
But what this means, people have to stop and consider what this means. This means that the Templar elite, the people in control of local and regional preceptories there, are going to be involved on a day-to-day basis, on a day-to-day operational and managerial basis with the Cathar elite.
Yes.
In whose country they are stationed.
Yeah.
Okay? All right? And if you suspect, let's just play scenario gaming here. If you're the papacy and you suspect something is up with this order, they've got lots of money, they're very powerful, and rumors are beginning to reach our papal ears that this order has some very strange beliefs and practices. Do you decide to strike and try and eliminate the entire thing all at once, or do you strike at the center of their power first?
Center of their power first.
Bingo, and that's what's done. It's called the Albigensian Crusade.
Oh, my goodness.
Now, let's look at something else. And I believe we may have talked about this, but just to refresh people's memory. When Innocent III It's actually, I think, Alexander VII that first calls for the crusade, and then he dies, and then Innocent III takes over.
Boy, he was a dude, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah, Lorenzo de Conti. He was, I think that was his name. He was a real piece of work.
Yeah.
Innocent III continues the call for the crusade. Now, let's understand first what this means. This is the papacy here. This is the other international bureaucracy.
Yeah.
When the papacy calls for a crusade, what this means is that every bishop, every clergyman, every archbishop throughout Western Europe has to preach the crusade. This is an international call. Mm-hmm. Okay? Now, the problem here is when he calls for this crusade, the two military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, do not obey it.
Oh.
They don't show up or participate in the crusade at all.
Oh.
And what is that going to send signals to the papacy? Well, we've heard rumors of strange beliefs, and we're going to take out their center of power, and they are not participating. That confirms it.
Oh.
That confirms it for you.
Oh, my
Something's going on, and you don't know exactly what it is, and you better find out.
Yeah.
So during the Albigensian Crusade, the leader of the crusade is a fellow by the name of Arnaud de Citeaux. He's the Grand Prior of, guess what? The Cistercian order.
Oh, boy.
Now, if you look back in Templar history, what do you find? You find the Templars allied to the Cistercians.
Yeah.
Why? Because Bernard de Clairvaux is the fellow that, in the Cistercian order, was the backer for the Templars, and he's the fellow that wrote their order.
Oh, my gosh.
He's the fellow that wrote their rule.
Oh.
So that tells you something else is going on, that an ally of the Templars has broken ranks.
Yes.
Okay? So you see, you're looking at something that the history books will never tell you. They put all this out there, but they're not drawing your attention to it so that you can see that there's something going on here behind the scenes.
Right.
Okay. So the Albigensian Crusade goes on, and at a certain point, the Albigensians, the Cathars, make their headquarters, that fortress at Montségur on top of the mountain there in the Languedoc of France. And 5 miles away is where Dominic makes his headquarters. Now, who's Dominic? Well, he's the founder of the Dominicans, right?
Oh, boy.
St. Dominic?
Yeah.
His name is Dominic Guzman, all right? Guzman, G-U-Z-M-A-N, a Spaniard, all right? Mm-hmm. And he founds the Dominicans. He's actually the guy that invents the rosary, the Roman Catholic rosary, all right?
Oh.
But he's also the founder of the Inquisition. Now, what really do we see with the Inquisition? What is the Inquisition?
Yeah, my question.
The Inquisition is founded precisely during the Albigensian Crusade to deal with what? Heresy. So what you're really looking at, is the papacy, if you read between the lines, is now no longer confident of the Templar order. Okay? It's taken the decision to strike at the center of Templar power in Europe. Okay? And since it can no longer rely on one of the branches of intelligence, namely the Templars, it creates its own counterintelligence. You're looking at the papal Gestapo.
Oh, boy.
It's a counterintelligence organization.
Yeah.
Okay? And it's founded for the express hidden purpose of finding out just what the heck these Cathars are doing. What is this relationship to the Templars? What is it that's really going on here? And, of course, the Inquisition has its own archives. Mm-hmm. Okay? This is the other thing that begins to happen. Let's roll the clock forward now to about half a century after the end of the Albigensian Crusade. Then we get Philippe le Bel, all right, King Philip the Fair of France, who is the monarch in Europe that decides, okay, we need to take care of the Templars.
Yeah.
We need to get rid of them. And Philip the Fair is the one that draws up this list of charges against the Templars. And he sends letters to all the crowned heads of Europe, to Spain, to the Holy Roman Emperors, to the German princes, to the King Edward II of England. And he lays out these charges. Well, they're worshiping a head. They don't say the words of institution at the Mass. They have secret initiations where they kiss each other on their private parts. And
oh, dear.
on and on. it's a list when you read it. It's just so outlandish. And in fact, the reaction of the other crowned heads of Europe was, "You've got to be kidding. You're joking, right? You want us to shut down the Templars on the basis of this?"
Oh.
You see what's going on?
Oh my gosh.
So in other words, I'm thinking, unlike many people, I think if you're gonna send crowned heads of Europe a list of charges that ridiculous, and expect them on the basis to round up the Templars, if your game is simply to get the Templar treasure to pay off loans, as is the textbook explanation, you're not going to compose a letter with such ridiculous charges to undermine your own purpose.
Yeah.
So in other words, I'm thinking that there has to be somewhere in this mix some hidden truth to those charges.
Oh boy.
Oh boy.
Well, they were worshiping the Baphomet.
Well, that's the charges, Georgianne.
Yeah.
That's the charges. There are many people that don't think they were involved in anything of the sort.
Yeah.
Okay, there's no good hard evidence other than what the Inquisition itself obtains, and in many cases it obtains this under torture.
Yeah.
Okay? The problem is that you start seeing the Templars in England and France agreeing to certain details of these charges. And there's another huge problem here. Some academics say that the idea of a Templar treasure is a complete myth, that it disappeared, that when Philip raided the preceptory there in Paris, he found nothing. And that's a clue right there. No account books? No archives? Where are the Templar archives?
Yeah.
Where did they go?
Yeah.
Now, by 1313, the order is officially suppressed. And Pope Clement V issues a decree at the Council of Vienne that the order is not only suppressed, but no one is ever to display any symbols of the order ever again.
Oh my gosh.
What does Columbus have boldly emblazoned on the ship's sails?
The
big red cross.
Yep.
Okay.
Oh my gosh.
So do you get the idea that something's going on under the surface of the textbooks that, is just outside of our sight?
Oh gosh, yes. Oh gee.
Okay.
Oh.
Now, here's the other thing that happens during the Templar suppression. In the year 1310, the Venetians found the Council of Ten.
Yeah.
And let's remember what the Venetian Council of Ten was. It was their Star Chamber, it was their Gestapo, it was their diplomatic service, it was their espionage service. In other words, this is the Venetian filling in for the vacuum created by the suppression of their allies, the Templars.
Oh boy.
And guess what? It becomes a refuge for them. So I'm thinking, in part, that some of the Templar archives made it to their good allies, the Venetians.
Uh-huh.
And I'm thinking that some of their archives came over here.
Probably.
And that some of their archives disappeared into the archives of the Inquisition, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's something going on, big, huge things behind the scenes. Now, the Nazi angle in this...
Yeah, oh boy. Oh gee, we can't get by without them guys.
No, we can't get by without the Nazis.
Yeah.
I also point out in the book that there was a German esoteric scholar by the name of Otto Rahn that journeyed to the Languedoc in the 1930s, journeyed around the Languedoc talking to local French people about their local legends and traditions about the Albigensian Crusade.
Yeah.
And he recounts running into a shepherd who told him that the armies of Satan, meaning the Crusaders, the armies of Satan were looking for the stones from Lucifer's crown to replace them in the crown of their leader.
Oh my gosh.
Meaning the papal tiara.
Yeah.
That just raised the stakes a little bit, didn't it?
Boy, you're not kidding. Wow.
So yeah, I think there's something going on here behind the scenes? Yes, definitely.
Oh, absolutely.
I think ultimately people will see in the book that there's a connection to what they were digging for in the Holy Land and Egypt, and it's one of those things that just going to smack people right between the eyes. And that in turn, just by the nature of the case, opens up so many, it opens up a Pandora's box of implications.
Yes.
That the charges of strange belief on the part of the Templar Order are contextually corroborated to a degree. In my opinion, a significant degree.
Did it have something to do with Christ?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I think so. But I think even more it had something to do with, again, the whole nature and foundation of and claims of Christian religion.
Yeah.
And this was very clearly perceived. But I also think that they found not just information, but that they found things.
Yes.
And the Otto Rahn incident is a clue. And again, I go back to something I wrote in Giza, Death Star Destroyed. People have to go back there and read toward the tail end of that book what it may have been. I think those, in turn, were moved again.
Oh, boy.
And perhaps even to the New World.
Oh. Yeah, well, they buried a lot of treasures in Nova Scotia. And
that's the story.
Other places.
You know, there's all that lore and books out there about Oak Island and all that. I have my doubts. I think what this is predates the Yahwist religions. And that it's very old. And that if any of these people in the Middle Ages figured this out or had an inkling of what it was, that the inclination would have been to keep it hidden.
Yeah. Well, they brainwashed everybody with Yahweh. Oh.
The implications are so profound, even with what I did put in the book, are so profound that it's very clear that there's bloodlines at work, that they are following agendas, that they are looking for things. The connections keep popping out over and over. And another interesting thing here that I mentioned in the book, since we're in the context of symbolic cosmology and ways of looking at things and all of this, to put it into context, the interesting thing is, and this was pointed out by an esoteric scholar by the name of René Guénon. All right, you're probably familiar with that name. Guénon pointed out that almost immediately, with the suppression of the Templar Order, within a mere, say, 3 or 4 decades, you have a sudden bursting forth in Western Europe of Hermetic doctrine and texts.
Yes.
And in his opinion, it's not coincidental. And in my opinion, it's not coincidental either, because the places where they burst forth are those northern Italian city-states, Venice, Padua, Florence, Genoa.
Yeah.
And, of course, those are the city-states associated with 2 things: banking and those military crusading orders.
Oh, boy.
You know, the Genoese were traditionally allied with the Hospitallers, and Venice with the Templars, and Padua and Florence kind of always flowing back and forth between the two. But you have, in other words, the military orders are associated very closely with these Italian city-states, where it just so happens banking suddenly emerges after the demise of the Templars, along with all these Hermetic doctrines. So I don't view this as coincidental.
No.
It's a threadbare connection, to be sure, but it's not coincidental.
No.
So I think he's correct. And you see, most interestingly, you see family connections of, I don't know of any other way to put it, of people involved during the early years of the beginnings of the rumblings of the 30 Years' War, the wars of religion in Europe.
Yeah.
You see the rumblings of families involved in what I call Hermetic politics.
Oh, boy.
Whose family connections go directly to some of the original 9 knights that founded the Templars.
Oh, my gosh.
So, again, are we looking at something huge and hidden right out in the open? I think so.
Wow, Joseph. That's awesome.
Yeah, there were people in Europe, just like Giordano Bruno. Giordano Bruno wasn't a one-off affair.
Yeah.
There were people in Europe that were looking at Protestantism and Roman Catholicism and saying, this Hermeticism stuff is a better way, and it has the potential to unite Europe around a very different type of religion and culture. And they were actively, politically trying to promote that agenda.
Well, do you think that might be what is coming as the New World religion?
I think there are definite signs that there are some people that think this way in the power elite. I'm thinking of Morris Strong and his weird little ashram in Colorado.
Yeah.
But these people are dabblers. These people are just involved in plain kookiness. I think that there are indicators that they're up to something vis-a-vis religion.
Yeah.
And have been for quite some time. Vatican II was not a reform of the Catholic Church. It was a revolution in the Catholic Church.
Yes.
And almost at the same time, you had many of the liturgical Protestant churches adopting similar ugliness in their ritual. And that was not, in my opinion, accidental. I think this is carefully coordinated. You had an open esotericist in the form of the Episcopalian Bishop James Pike that was promoting schemes of church union along socially engineered lines. So, again, Hermeticism isn't by the nature of the case necessarily a bad thing, but by the same token, it's not necessarily a good thing. It's how it's used. There were Hermetic Jesuits, and I'm seeing odd little signs again that impulse within the Jesuit order is alive and well again. Think of Athanasius Kircher. Talk about a Hermeticist. Well, he was also a Jesuit and thoroughly loyal to the papacy. So it's not so much that the papacy is opposed to it; it just wants to control it.
Yeah.
We can't have anybody working out the implications of that metaphor and being really independent.
Right.
And that's the problem with it. I said long ago, the metaphor doesn't really permit one to think in terms of some revealed religion or sanctioned institution, and all others are heretical or off the mark or what have you. It doesn't permit that.
Yeah.
So it's already a twisting of it, and I see signs of that. I mean, who's the Pope right now? Well, he's a Jesuit, and he's saying some very weird things.
Yeah. Yes, he is.
And why do we have an Egyptian obelisk smack dab in the center of the St. Peter's Plaza in the Vatican?
And Washington, D.C.
And Washington, D.C. And, I've said all along, folks, that Christianity fundamentally is Egyptian Osirianism in disguise.
Yes.
And I think you have two factions, again, playing out for control of this thing. And So, symbolic, there's a symbol right there.
Well, with the Inquisition, and they went after little people.
Yes. For stupid things.
Yeah.
Thought police.
Yeah, why? Didn't the executioners get the message?
Well, like all counterintelligence things, when you create a domestic enemy, the problem is you can never be sure you got all of them.
Yeah.
And, it begins to possess its own bureaucratic inertia. And, once the ball gets going, it's just like Stalin's purges. Well, this general knew that general and that officer, and we didn't round them up the last time. We better bring them in for questioning, too,
Yeah.
On and on it goes. And the other thing people have to remember is the Inquisition, there were financial components to the Inquisition.
Yes.
If you were accused of heresy, that, your possessions were forfeit. So it was literally a way to rob people.
Yeah.
Thought police. And it's the same old technique we're seeing today.
Well,
it's the same old technique.
They've got, in the new psychiatric manual, they've got this thing, nonconformity is a mental illness.
Oh, yeah, I know. Talk about Soviet psychiatry.
Yeah.
Again, there's nothing new under the sun. This isn't new. It's not the first time in human history that all of this junk has happened.
Yeah.
The mark of insanity is to keep trying the same thing over and over again and expect a different result.
Yeah.
So, the insanity isn't with the nonconformists, it's with the people that keep proposing these same old solutions that ultimately never work and never make themselves or anyone else secure.
Yeah. Well, they're not concerned about our security.
No, I know. They're concerned with theirs, but that's my point. Ultimately, they don't make themselves secure. It didn't work out too well for the communists.
Yeah.
It didn't work out for the Nazis. It didn't work out for the fascists. It didn't work out in the Middle Ages with the Inquisition. Half of Europe bolted and Western Europe bolted and went Protestant.
Yeah.
Talk about a blunder.
Yeah. Oh, my gosh.
They don't work.
Well, you'd think they'd get the message, it doesn't work, guys.
Well, evil people are irrational.
Yes.
And to expect rationality and sanity from psychopaths is really probably not a terribly good thing.
Oh. Well, I think a lot of them up there now are purely psychopathic. They have no empathy for anybody.
No, no argument from me. They're a class of ne'er-do-wells. I mean, one showed up and invited me to a party. I wouldn't particularly want to go.
No, I don't
want to associate with those people.
Me neither. Oh gosh, wow.
Can we be friends? No.
Yeah, can we be friends? No. Gee. Oh, gosh. Oh, my gosh, Joseph. Well, the Templars, the Church, the Inquisition, oh, my gosh, Venice. Oh.
Yeah, there's something, what I'm trying to really get people to do is to take the same mentality that they are applying to modern news or modern history, like the Kennedy assassination or Watergate or what have you, and take the same mentality of looking at the public narratives and taking careful notes and comparing notes.
Yeah.
Take that same mentality and apply it to the Middle Ages and see what you come up with.
Oh, yeah.
And what you come up with is not this bland recitation of, this crusade and that crusade and this prince married that princess and, the typical textbook approach. When you peel behind the bland layers of academic historiography, you get a very different picture of something huge and with a long-term agenda going on. And again, if you can't see that, then in my opinion, you're kind of probably in the same camp as those people that news anchors and so on that constantly get on the air and boast that, they believe the Warren Commission and that Lee Harvey shot President Kennedy and, there's no evidence to the contrary. Not mentioning any names, to spare their families from embarrassment.
I heard a new twist on the Kennedy assassination. The reason, and here it is, the reason that Jacqueline went over the back of the car was because she shot Kennedy.
Oh, I've heard everything, every ridiculous thing. I don't believe that for a moment. I've heard that the driver stopped the car, pulled out a pistol, turned around, and popped him in the head. I tend to stick with kind of, quote-unquote, the mainstream conspiracy theories here.
Sure, just read your book.
Yeah, thanks. No, I don't credit any of that, but there is, I certainly, people have to understand when criticism of the official line starts to happen, the first thing that is done is craziness is promoted by shills.
Yes.
To make anyone that thinks that there's something wrong with the official story look crazy.
Yeah.
And, again, if you want to look at the Middle Ages as this bland recitation of princesses marrying princes and this crusade and that crusade and this pope was a real jackass and slaughtered a bunch of, if you want to look at it in that way and not see the dots that are connected and how they flow into each other and the questions that are being raised, then, go right on believing the Warren report,
Yeah, exactly. Oh, Joseph.
But don't email me about it because I'm not in agreement with you. So.
Exactly. This has been an exciting time, and it's you connect so many dots in our audio files. My goodness. And I know that the listeners really appreciate what you do.
I hope so. I hope they'll enjoy the new book. There's quite a lot of literary criticism and music theory in it, but just simply for the purpose of showing people that this Hermetic influence was very detailed and very deep. And informs our culture in ways that most people wouldn't even begin to guess.
And remember, be nice to Georgianne.
And be nice to Georgianne.
Yeah,
I don't honestly know what that individual was talking about, but if I was nice, I apologize.
Oh,
I honestly don't know what it was I wasn't being nice about.
Well, sometimes I ask you questions, the same question in different ways, and I think you kind of get exasperated with me at times.
Well, maybe I do. I don't know.
But that's okay.
I can't recall being exasperated.
But that's okay.
But anyway, Anyway.
Well, bless your heart. Everybody.
You too.
No, thank you.
Yes, help George and PayPal button out.
Yes.
Please.
She needs it. Oh.
I think we all do, hon.
Yep. And Joseph Farrell has a PayPal button on his site, GizaDeathStar.com. Please make use of it so we can keep up these fantastic, wonderful conversations that we have. I know that you enjoy these things, and it gladdens my heart to be able to produce them for you. So God bless everybody out there that's listening and paying attention. Buy Joseph Farrell's books. Joseph, do you know I've had several people email me that they have collected all of your books?
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I hope they're buying them new.
I hope so, too.
Not dog-eared copies.
Yeah. And marked up and what have you.
Marked up and what have you.
Yeah. So, anything else?
Nope, that's it.
Okay, dear heart. Good night,
Good
and
night, everybody.
good night to all of you out there. And God bless you for listening. Good night.